Padraig and Oliver, you can unmute your mics. I've muted everybody else.
I have unmuted mine, so if Oliver unmutes his as well then.
Yeah, I'm okay now. Can you hear me, Padraig? Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay.
I think we'll kick off. Yeah, no problem. We'll kick off, so. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society's lectures. This being the first in our winter series 2020-2021. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the online version of lectures. It's a new departure for us. It's a new experiment. And hopefully tonight's will be enjoyable for all of us. Welcome Oliver, and who will present the lecture, which is an excellent lecture to say the least. Just to bear in mind, normally if I were in a hotel, I'd ask you now to put your phones on silent and point out the various exits. So tonight it's slightly different. So everyone's mic is on mute. Please keep them that way to prevent feedback on the system. And secondly, if you find that the video signal is not strong or the internet's weak, just turn the video off, turn the camera off, and that seems to help. Questions will be answered at the end of the lecture, but since we're using Zoom, it's possible to type your questions during the lecture into the chat box and we can deal with them that way. Oliver is a native of Hacketstown, County Carlow, and a proud Carlow man. Before his retirement, he was director of the National Treasury Management Agency. In 2019, he published, I don't know if you can see this book I'm holding up, as part of his studies in Maynooth, and it's publication of part of Maynooth Studies in Local History, entitled Landholding in the New English Settlement of Hacketstown, County Carlow, 1635 to 1875, and it's based on the research he did for his master's thesis. The book is available in local bookshops, and I gather Oliver has some for sale as well. Currently, he's doing research on the struggle between landlords and tenants for ownership in the lands in County Carlow. The lecture itself that Oliver's given is titled Evolution from Landlords to Tenant Proprietors, the Story of Hacketstown, New English Settlement over 250 years. And I'll give you a hint. It starts from the Duke of Ormond leased land in County Carlow to a Lancaster man. So sit back, make yourselves comfortable, enjoy the lecture, and over to you, Oliver.
Thank you, Padraig, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I'm going to talk about over 2.5 centuries of an aspect of the history of Hacketstown. It's about the landholding in that area, and just to Dusty Down's survey map of the 16th century, showing the lordship of Clonmore, which is the area I'm talking about, and Hacketstown there. We begin with as Padraig has, with the butlers, the Dukes of Ormond, and their strategy was to surround their core holdings in Kilkenny with a number of satellite fortified holdings, and these would be in the hands of members of the family and would, it was hoped, keep their rivals at bay. The butlers held castles in Tullow and Clonmore as part of this defensive shield. And in this case, they wanted to protect their lands against attacks from the O'Byrnes and other families in West Wicklow. And you can see that Clonmore, where we're talking about tonight, is way up at the edge of the Butler territory, really, around bordering on West Wicklow. And as part of the strategy, the Duke of Ormond leased land in Hacketstown area to a Lancashire man, Thomas Watson, in the early 1600s to establish a settlement there. And we know a fair bit about it because another Lancashire man who was touring Ireland in 1635 actually went to Hacketstown as part of his tour and met his fellow Lancashire man, Thomas Watson. So William Brereton kept a diary of what he was, of his travels. And it was difficult enough, he said, getting to Hacketstown, we passed through troublesome and dangerous ways and woods, and would have wandered all night had we not hired an Irish guide, by whose direction then we arrived at 11 hour in Hacketstown, where we lodged in a low, poor, thatched castle, most inconveniently seated amongst the mountains, barren, dry soil and not easily improved. But all wasn't lost, because he said, here is good butter made, as in England, and they say good cheese, though I tasted none. And here Mr. Watson has erected a dainty new church and maintains a good minister. He allows
Oliver,
him, yes?
could I break in there a little bit?
Yes.
I think the sound is a little bit low. If you could speak up or maybe speak closer to your microphone. I think people are having trouble hearing it. Sorry about that now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay, we'll keep going. Okay, we'll keep going then. So he set up his colony. This is Brereton in 1635, July 1635, describing what he found. And he was entertained there all night, he said, by Mr. Needham and a man who married Mr. Watson's sister. So you see that Watson, when he came over to establish his colony, brought some family members with him. And then Hacketstown, the settlement was similar to the new towns established in Ulster following the flight of the Earls in 1607. The layout of these towns was planned, and they generally had wide main streets. And typically they would have brought over entrepreneurs such as Thomas Watson from Britain to work the new settlements. This is a picture of Hacketstown in June of this, or in April of this year, when in the middle of COVID, there was absolutely nothing on the street. I don't think I've ever seen it as empty, but you do get an impression of the wide main street, and the church at the top of the street is where the castle that's referred to would have been, the Hacketstown Castle. And the town developed, Watson had a 50-year lease from the Duke of Ormond, and we know he brought people with him. Other people I haven't mentioned was said it was a person called Anne Hill, whose husband had a business interest in England and who owned land in Gloucestershire. So basically Watson was trying to establish a regular Protestant plantation village in the English style. And the town did develop as a centre to provide a range of services associated with smaller towns. We have evidence of a minister, a merchant, a blacksmith, a tailor, a cooper, a weaver, a harness maker, a chapman or peddler, an innkeeper, and a tuck mill, that's a water mill used in cloth manufacture. And of course, as Brereton said, the settlement produced good butter and cheese. And we'll look at some of the settlers who were there. This guy, John Torkington, leased land for 30 years from Watson. And he was a cooper who also operated a general store and merchant business. And he had business interests in Enniscorthy. Because when Burton went to Enniscorthy 3 days after his visit to Hacketstown, he bought a little white mare from Torkington for £2 and 4 shillings, on condition that if he returned the horse to Hacketstown at the end of his journey, he would be charged at a rate of 3 pence per day. So it was a good down payment to encourage him to bring back the horse. And then Mr. Needham, who was mentioned, who entertained Brereton in Hacketstown, also went with him to Enniscorthy and arranged further contacts for Brereton with another Englishman in Waterford. So we can see here the network of communication between the settlements in the country. And the next guy you mentioned is William Bailey, an English Protestant merchant. And he had quite an affluent clientele in the town, with tastes for such items as cinnamon and cloves and mace and nutmeg, which would be good, he said, for morning draughts, as well as black maple silk and fine thread. So it was a thriving centre in that sense. Then it was expensive. Watson borrowed heavily to support his enterprise in the town. In 1640, he borrowed a very substantial sum of £600 on the Dublin staple, and that was a large sum. Of the 50 Carlow borrowers on the Dublin staple in the previous 40 years, only 9 of those would have had larger borrowings than Watson. And just to say, by the way, that the staple was set up in the late 1200s to regulate trade in staple or basic commodities, such as wool, leather, and sheepskins. And then it developed as a place where landowners from plantations in Ireland could borrow money, which was provided to the staple by creditors who came mainly from the Dublin mercantile class. This was, of course, in the era before banks had become widespread. I mean, the Bank of England wasn't set up until 1694, well after this date. Now, Watson paid an annual rent of £260 and the return of a dairy herd of 20 cows to two Dublin businessmen for the lease of 3 townlands and part of another townland. But he himself, then Watson, received rents from his lands to the value of £460 a year. So he was renting land to tenants at the same time as he was leasing land around Hacketstown from Dublin merchants. And Watson put his losses in the 1641 rebellion at just over £1,800. That would be roughly £250,000 in today's money. So it was quite substantial. We just look at the 1641 rebellion and what happened in Hacketstown. It was quite traumatic. The rebellion began when the Gaelic Irish in Ulster sought redress for the grievances resulting from the plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s, when many of the native Irish lost their lands. And it very quickly spread. Within a week, it's incredible to think, within a week it was in Hacketstown, because we read that on the 28th of October, Thomas Poole in Cronaskea suffered losses of £268 at the hands of the rebels. And less than 2 weeks later, on the 11th of November, George Morris of Clonmore was attacked and driven from his house by one Turlough Byrne of Longford, not far from him, and a group of rebels, including soldiers. And the soldiers were interesting. We'll come back to them later on. And just as an aside, just about Clonmore Castle to say, it was destroyed around this time. It was captured and blown up by Cromwell's forces in 1650, at a time when both sides in the English Civil War had rival armies in Ireland. And also what we call the Old English Catholics in West Wicklow, they would have been the descendants of the original Norman invaders way back in the 1100s and 1200s, before the Reformation, and who had remained Catholic. And they threw the lot with the Gaelic Catholic rebellion, somewhat uncomfortably, I think, but they felt they had no choice. And so we find that the Wickham family of Barraderry played an active role with the rebels in the Hacketstown area, even though one of the family, Peter Wickham, had been High Sheriff of County Wicklow. And we also find that another, Alexander Wickham, and a yeoman called Piers Grace from an Old English Catholic family in Borkelmore joined up with Turlough Byrne from Kilmacart to attack Henry Bellingham's house in Philipstown near Radvilly. So the coordinated action, if you like, of the Old English Catholics and the native Irish Catholics was a feature of the rebellion. And in fact, 3 of the Wickham family were outlawed for high treason in 1642. And Peter lost all his lands in Wicklow after the rebellion, but he was granted 800 or so acres in Galway. He was one of those, if you like, who was transplanted to Connacht under Cromwell's regime. Now, the violence unleashed by the rebellion caused many of the settlers to flee from Hacketstown for fear of their lives. Thomas Watson, the founder of the settlement, fled to Castledermot and on to Dublin. Richard Gibson, he was a JP for Carlow, and he lived in Williamstown. And he said that he was very ill. He fled from his farm when all the English householders of Hacketstown had fled, and he reached Dublin after 4 days. Other settlers also sought the safety of Dublin, bringing as much livestock and goods as possible with them. Now, the journey was difficult and dangerous, and sometimes resulted in the loss of goods or injury and even death at the hands of the rebels. So John Davies of Longford, he died from injuries received while driving his cattle to Dublin. And George Morris, whom we've met from Clonmore, he was robbed of goods totaling £25, 10 shillings in Baltinglass when he was on the way to Dublin. And his troubles weren't over, because in Crumlin, the rebels stole his mare, which was worth £2 10 shillings. And John Anthony of Kilmacart, he had 100 cattle stolen from his servants as they attempted to bring them to Dublin. Now, some of the residents took another tack and fled to Carlow Castle, which was obviously much closer and easier, but not that easy to get. It was still very, very difficult going there. And in the country, generally, the rebels moved about in large groups of armed bands, and that was the same in the Hacketstown area. So we see Turlough with a group of about 60 people attacking Clonmore Castle, Hacketstown Castle rather, and again with about 20 people attacking Clonmore Castle. And these were places where people had stored their goods for safety. But what was going on in Hacketstown wasn't happening in a vacuum. They were coordinated with a broader and more centralized rebel structure. We see a couple of examples of this. So when Thomas James of Drumquin was imprisoned by the rebels for 16 months, he was eventually able to make his way to Dublin with his wife and son when the rebels who held him secured a pass which allowed him to travel through lands held by the rebels. And this pass was signed by Theobald the Butler, who had mobilized the rebel army in County Tipperary. So you see, Butler's authority was recognized by rebels in Hacketstown and indeed between Hacketstown and Dublin as Thomas James was able to make his way up. And the Wicklow man Luke Byrne commanded a rebel camp in Carnew. And Murtagh McAway from Hacketstown, who was very active in the area, was reported to be part of the rebel camp in Carnew. And the rebels in Baltinglass who took the goods from John Davies of Killalongford also claimed that they were providing supplies for Byrne's camp. Now, this kind of breakdown of existing structures in society, of course, is never neat. And the 1641 rebellion was no exception. It gave rise to tension and confusion and perhaps some personal animosities within the settler community in Hacketstown. One of the settlers, John Slater, reported in 1642 a hearsay story that William Bailey, whom we have met as a merchant earlier on, who he said was formerly an English Protestant, is now revolted and gone to mass. Now, this story doesn't seem to be true because Bailey turns up later on in his original guise. So I think there is this amount of hearsay about that. But we have another story from a lady called Anne Lister in Hacketstown. And she named several Protestants from her area and further afield who had gone to mass, she said. And in addition, she said she credibly heard that 8 Irish Protestants also went to mass. And she named them, I put just the names up there, O'Donnell, Martin, McAway, Curran, Maguire, Morris, O'Cullen and Byrne. Now, I'm not sure whether everything shared was true because Murtagh McAway was part of the rebel camp in Carnew, so I doubt if he fits into that company very well. But nonetheless, I guess there's some substance to what she was saying. And it may be showing the strength of the colony established in Hacketstown by Thomas Watson, and an indication that at this time there were Gaelic Irish members of the local Protestant church community. Now, during the rebellion, attempts were made to force Protestants to adopt Catholic religious practice, and some did so for fear of their lives or to preserve their property. Edmund Arley in Coolmanna is one of several people who refer to rebel promises that Protestants who changed their religious allegiance would have their goods restored. And the breakdown of social order following the outbreak of the rebellion unveiled a deep-seated hatred of the settlers by the rebels and led to the overturn of the established social order and to widespread looting and seizure of property. However, these gruesome attacks were not intended to take the lives of their victims, and they generally didn't do so. Some of those who reneged on their existing obligations held important positions in the social hierarchy, while others were from a class have been described as masterless men, whose reaction, once the government's authority was challenged, could not be predicted. And these included soldiers recently discharged from Wentworth's army. And we have seen that there were soldiers among those who attacked the house of George Morris in Clonmore in the early stages of the rebellion. And just referring to Wentworth soldiers, we can recall that Wentworth was Lord Deputy of Ireland and held extensive lands in the Shillelagh area. And he was recalled to England in September 1639 and executed there in May 1641. But returning to the social upheaval of the rebellion, the settlers often found that their servants had joined the rebellion. So Thomas Watson, the founder of the settlement, had to leave his valuable livestock at the hands of his servants when he fled. And he later heard that the servants had joined the rebellion. Thomas Jones of Hacketstown had property stolen by a group of rebels who included 3 of his own tenants. And at the lower end of the social pyramid, if you like, we have one Morris Bowen of Clonmore, described as a lowly cowherd who, it was said, by virtue of his robbery and pillaging, became a famous and rich rebel and the commander of rebels. So it's the social order really was stood on its head at that point, and a number of people had fled. Now, what happened to Hacketstown after the rebellion was put down? Well, for 40% of the people, the settlers who made depositions or official statements about their losses in the rebellion, had moved from the area. But the settlement did prove resilient, and many yeomen and others remained. And for instance, John Watson, the rector of Hacketstown, not the founder of not Thomas Watson, the founder, but John Watson, it was a very common name at the time, it seems. The rector seems to have remained in the area, and he went out to serve in a number of other church appointments, including Dean of Loughlin and Dean of Ferns, until his death in 1665. And a census taken in 1659, that would be 18 years after the rebellion, confirms a continued strong English presence in the Hacketstown area. So we see that in that census, some 14% of the population of County Carlow are classified as English, while 38% of the population in Hacketstown and Clonmore fits into this category. So it's a much higher, indicating a very strong presence of English people in the area at the time. And commercial activity did recover in Hacketstown after the 1641 rebellion. Almost 25 years later, in 1665, one of the town's gentry, Thomas Bury, borrowed £220 on the Dublin staple at a time when borrowing by Carlow residents was rare. In a 20-year period around this time, only 10 people from Carlow borrowed on the Dublin staple, and one of them was the Hacketstown merchant Bury. Now, moving into the 1700s, you see that following the trauma of the 1600s, the rebellion of 1641, the victory of Cromwell's parliamentary forces in the English Civil War, and Cromwell's suppression of all opposition in Ireland, the 1700s were relatively peaceful. That is, until the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion. And we found in the early 1700s, there were 2 Dublin business partners, Benjamin Burton and Francis Harrison, who began widespread speculation in land and property in and around Carlow town and in the Hacketstown Clonmore region. Now, Benjamin Burton was a significant political figure in early 18th century Dublin. He was a member of Parliament for the city, and he was Lord Mayor. And of course, he purchased lands in Carlow, which became known as Burton Hall. And he and his business partner, Francis Harrison, established a successful bank in Dublin in the early 1700s. And in 1709, Harrison purchased the land around Hacketstown and Clonmore from the Duke of Ormond for a sum of £15,000. And I just explain where the area we're talking about is referred to as the Lordship of Clonmore. It's an area of about 13,000 acres, which Harrison bought from the Duke. And it is centred on Hacketstown and Clonmore. The entire area is in County Carlow. Sometimes referred to events outside this area because they involved people from the area or were important for people living in the area. So some of the people like the old English Catholics in Burton and in West Wicklow would not have been part of the lordship, but they would have been obviously very important figures in it, in the area. Now, so Harrison had bought the land, and then about 8 years after Harrison bought it, he leased it to Burton for £4,500 and an annual rent of £1,000. And then they both began to lease the land to tenants to make a return from their investments. And apart from business people in Dublin who had an interest in Carlow, we find that the Court of Chancery also invested in Hacketstown. The court was responsible for the investment of funds entrusted to it for the benefit of the children whose parents had died. And in 1726, it invested £1,500 by leasing 9 townlands around Hacketstown for a yearly rent of £300. And there are other Killalongford, down around, surrounding Clonmore itself, you've Killalongford, Ballyshannon, Ballyduff, Ballynakill, Raheen, and Kycrin. And in Hacketstown, you have 3 more: Brownbog, Kilmacart, and Hacketstown itself. Just through just a map, there's Clonmore and the area then, which the court had leased, and there's Hacketstown and a smaller area there, which the court had leased. And when we take account of the dealings of Harrison and Burton and the court, we find that these 9 townlands changed hands on 4 occasions in the space of 17 years around this time. So we see there the speculative short-term nature of many of the land investments by this wealthy elite from outside the area, but also what we might call the bona fide use of the lands by the Court of Chancery when investing funds for the benefit of the children whose care it had. Now, the bank of Harrison and Burton didn't fare too well. Following the deaths of Harrison and Burton in the second half of the 1720s, the bank failed eventually in 1733, and the winding up of the affairs of the bank was a long and complex affair. As we know, these things can be from the experience with Anglo-Irish Bank ourselves after 2008. So the lands which Harrison and Burton had owned in the Hacketstown-Clonmore area were eventually sold for the benefit of their creditors for a total of £41,150. And then they came into the possession of Robert Howard, who was Bishop of Elphin around 1738-39. Not sure, he probably bought it directly, but it's not clear from the evidence that he did, but certainly he came into his hands very quickly. So it's likely that he did buy it directly from the liquidators of the bank, if you like. Howard belonged to the Howard family, whose base was in Shelton Abbey near Archaeological. And of course, they became Earls of Wicklow at a later stage in the 1700s. And on the way to that respectable position, the bishop's son, a fellow called Ralph Howard, became Baron of Clonmore in 1740. And in 1776, he became Viscount Wicklow. And then somewhat later, he had died. His widow became Countess Wicklow, and then her son became the second Earl of Wicklow. So they were on an upward path socially and politically. And they were all, the family of Charles Stewart Parnell was related to the Howard family. And we see that in 1858, John Henry Parnell, who was the father of Charles Stewart, bought the Hacketstown-Clonmore lands from his maternal uncle, which was another Ralph Howard. So during the 150 years, roughly from 1709 until 1858, there were just 2 owners of the estate. The bankers Burton and Harrison for about 27 years, and the Howard family for 122 years. But within that period, there was much activity as owners leased parcels of the estate to tenants who further subleased them. And I'll mention just a few of the players here. Some of the outside investors who came and invested in Hacketstown came from the professional classes in Dublin. So In 1726, we find Benjamin Burton leased land in Hacketstown at a peppercorn or nominal rent to Samuel Chapman of Dublin, is in payment for Chapman's services over many years. And after Chapman's death, the rent was to be £10 per annum on the lands. And another Dublin resident, Alexander Carroll, also held lands in the town, and in 1752 he leased them to James Cullen for an annual rent of £50. And again, we'll come across Cullen very shortly. But at a level below the wealthy absentee speculators, a number of families living locally began to assemble sizable holdings. Some of these are to be found among the leading landholders in the parish of Hacketstown about 100 years later, around the time of Griffith's valuation in the 1850s. One of these families was the Hardy family of Kilmacart. The family is famous locally, of course, from the death of Captain Thomas Hardy in the Battle of Hacketstown during the 1798 rebellion. However, as early as 1725, Francis Hardy, the grandfather of the captain, had leased 320 acres near Hacketstown. Now, both the captain and his grandfather are buried in Hacketstown churchyard. The family remain small-scale holders, much below the level of the local landed gentry. And maybe on a personal note, I just mentioned that they lived in a place called Kilmacart House, which is known to everybody in Hacketstown now as the Moat. And it's lived in by my brother Willie and his wife Dolly. The ghost of Captain Hardy was supposed to inhabit the house, but they've been there for over 50 years, so he hasn't appeared in the meantime. I suspect, like a lot of ghosts, the coming of electricity probably banished them. Another family, the Morton family, you'll excuse the sound in the background there, I keep going. The Morton family in the town built up a considerable holding from the early decades of the 1700s. By the mid-1800s, Harriet Morton of Hacketstown held most of these lands, and she's listed in Griffith as owning more than 630 acres in Drumgwyn, Brown Bog and Kilconnock, Eagle Hill. And in 1857, she married an English Army captain in England. And indeed, I have a record that she died in London in 1916 at the ripe old age of 84. And in 1914, 2 years before her death, she sold her Hacketstown lands to the tenants under the Land Acts. And we'll come across that later as well. And I might add that we have quite a few instances of the daughters of the settlers in Hacketstown marrying army officers in the English Army. Now, another settler called Henry Whitestone leased lands in Hacketstown from Benjamin Burton in about 1723. And Griffith's valuation in the mid-1850s shows a James Whitestone holding 200 acres near the town. And indeed, 46 years later, that in 1898, another James Whitestone sold 200 acres in Ballasalla, again under the very early Land Acts before the major sellouts, but he sold his land there. And an interesting aside is that in 1729, Henry Whitestone leased a site in Hacketstown to David Moffat from Brown Bog for the construction of a slate house with lime and stone. And while Moffat's name is not found in Griffith's valuation for Hacketstown, it has, of course, survived as a street name in the modern town. We'll just move on from there to talk about the penal laws and what happened there, the emergence from the penal laws, essentially. You know, the penal laws were in effect during the first 3/4 of the 1700s. And one effect of the penal laws was that Catholics could not own land and could not lease it for longer than 31 years. And the records in the Registry of Deeds in Dublin show that all leasing in Hacketstown, Clonmore during the first 3/4 of the 1700s was carried out strictly in compliance with those penal laws. So we'll look at the response, and we'll look at the examples of two Catholic families, how they dealt in the different ways with the difficulties posed by the penal laws. First, we have the case of Charles Byrne. He belonged to the Clonmore branch of the O'Byrne clan of Wicklow. And he's an example of a Catholic who conformed to Protestant religious practice and accordingly was able, along with his son Gerald, to undertake extensive land transactions in Queen's County, County Laois, up to the time of his death in 1768. And he made provisions in his will of 1765 to ensure that his property would be inherited only by Protestant members of the family. His worry at that stage was his son Gerald, who was aged 60 and was unmarried. So he was making sure that if his son had any future Catholic children, those children would not inherit the land. Charles, by the way, is buried in the family vault in Clonmore. And another family we look at is the Cullen family. We've mentioned him briefly before, of leasing land in the early mid-1700s. They were a prosperous Catholic family, and they negotiated their way through the penal laws in a different manner. We can see from the family connections that the Cullens had that they belonged to the relatively wealthy Catholic class who carved out careers in trade and as middlemen landowners to the extent permitted by the penal laws. And in 1750, James Cullen married Elizabeth Byrne, daughter of Walter Byrne of Kiloctor, County Wicklow. It's near Ashford. And that was the seat of one of the O'Byrne clan again in County Wicklow, so he was well connected. And the Cullen was established early on in the early 1700s. We've mentioned already that Alexander Carroll leased property to James Cullen in 1752. That lease included 62 acres beside the town, along with a dwelling house, a brew house, a stable, a cow house, a turf house, a garden, and a plot of land in the street described as running backwards as far as the old wall of the castle. That to be discussed where we saw earlier the site of today's Catholic Church. And it was on that plot that Lawrence Cullen also built two houses and a malt house. So it was really quite a substantial merchant in the town. When he leased his land initially in 1752, just for 31 years, and that was the most that was allowed for Catholics under their penal laws. When he renewed the lease in 1785, he had the benefit of relief acts passed in the 1770s, which effectively abolished the restrictions imposed by the penal laws. So his new lease in 1785 was at an annual rent of £70. That was a 40% increase on the 1752 lease. And it was for the duration of 3 named individuals, which would have been common at the time. So there was no question of a 31-year limit. So Cullen is an example of the Catholic merchants who emerged during the period of the penal laws, when I suppose most Catholics were either tenants or labourers on the estates of Protestant landowners. And generally, why did this happen? But generally, the ascendancy class viewed a career as a merchant or a trade with contempt. And this facilitated the entry of some Catholics into those professions. And while the wealthy Catholic merchants tend to be found in the seaport towns such as Cork, which is famous for them, Cullen is an example of the same thing in a small rural town. His landholdings were relatively small, but his business interests extended to all kinds of areas, like the provision of alcoholic drink, to his malt house and his brew house, and the construction of houses, presumably to generate an income. There's an intriguing twist to the end of the Cullen story, when there was a dispute between himself and Garrett Byrne of Ballymanus. And this dispute had to be resolved, and it was the terms of the resolution were registered in a deed of trust, and it was registered in the Registry of Deeds in Dublin, so it was heavy-hitting legal stuff. Garrett Byrne had married Cullen's niece, and it says several disputes and differences had arisen relating to the bride's marriage portion and concerning the title to certain lands in Hacketstown. And indeed, the marriage was reputed to be an unhappy one. Gareth Byrne's family were disappointed that the bride didn't have much, if any, of a fortune to bring to the marriage. But going back to the leasing, generally speaking, we can say that towards the end of the 1700s and into the 1800s, when agricultural prices were rising, partly due to the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, there was a tendency towards granting of shorter leases so the landlord could renew the lease often and get an increase in income. And the new leases in Hacketstown, Clonmore area in the early 1800s followed the same trend and tended to be for shorter periods. But also with the lifting of the penal laws, there was a lessening of the sharp differential between Catholic and Protestant tenants as the century progressed. And we find that three-quarter way through the century, around the 1870s, Henry Tudor Parnell granted 31-year leases to 8 tenants, of whom 3 were Protestants and 5 were Catholics. Another common thing in the 18th and 19th centuries was using your land as a way of raising cash. People still have to provide collateral for borrowing, so whatever you happen to have, you'll do it. But the landholders use their lands as security for borrowings to fund their expensive lifestyles and to provide for their children. And in Hacketstown, some of these were relatively small holders who lived in the area, while there were also much larger amounts borrowed by non-resident landholders who held extensive lands elsewhere in addition to their holdings in Hacketstown. And I'll just mention just a few of those. We have a guy called Roland Davis, who borrowed about £210 around 1730, probably to support his family of 6 sons. He was a man of some means. One of his sons was a trainee lawyer in Dublin, or in London, and those debts, they were outstanding for a long time. They were repaid some 58 years later by Davis's son. In 1774, a much bigger scale, Richard Barrett of Feathered in County Wexford borrowed £1,000 from John Hobson in Dublin under security of 490 acres in Coolmana and several other premises in Hacketstown. And a more problematical one was John Henry Leonard. He held leased on 900 acres in the Hacketstown, Eagle Hill, Ratnafishoke, Ratnagrue and Little Scotland areas. And he had also other properties in Carlow and Kildare, Kilkenny and Dublin. He started life as a coal merchant in Cork and had done very well. He used his lands in Hacketstown and the other places as collateral for borrowings from a broad range of creditors, including his brother and members of the professional and merchant classes in Dublin. But things went badly for Leonard, and in the 1860s, his creditors, including his brother, took legal action against him for the debts of about £4,000. In most cases, the creditors obtained court judgments, but they were unable to collect the money and repeatedly went back to court with little effect, because in 1864, Leonard dealt with his problems by fleeing to Australia, and that was the end of your chances of getting anything back from that. Just moving on now, we're coming towards the phase of, well on to towards the final phases of the story of landholding. And we've seen the penal laws, restrictions on the ability of Catholics to hold lands were abolished by the Relief Acts of the late 1870s, and how in the 1800s new leases were generally granted for shorter periods, and the differentiation between Catholic and Protestant tenants became less marked over that century. Now, during the third quarter of the 19th century, that would be around 1850 to 1874, the terms on which tenants held their lands in Hacketstown, Clonmore were greatly improved for most people. Generally speaking, since the 1700s, tenants held their lands under leases from landlords. the leases would generally last for the lifetime of 3 named individuals. And in most cases, when any one of the named individuals died, the tenant had the right to insert in the lease the name of another person in his place. But the tenant was generally required to pay the landlord half a year's rent for the privilege of doing that. So legislation in 1849 gave people the right who held land under lease, as opposed to holding them just by yearly tenancies, the right to obtain what was called a fee farm grant. And the fee farm grant was similar to what we know as fee simple, absolute ownership, that it gave the tenant the right to freehold possession of the land forever, but it was subject to the payment of an annual fixed rent. And tenants generally saw the fee farm grant as a big improvement. So when that new act came into effect, there was about 10,000 acres in the Clonmore, Hacketstown Clonmore estate. It was held under these renewable leases and eligible to benefit from the act. And indeed, 80% of the owners of 80% of the land opted to convert to a fee farm status with its fixed annual income. Unusually, only about 10–11% of the land on the estate was under yearly tenancies, and so it couldn't benefit from the fee farm grant. And this was a very low level of yearly tenancies by the general standards of landlords of the time. In around 1870, I'd say about 80% of all Irish tenants were still subject to yearly tenancies. And many landlords made strenuous efforts to convert leaseholdings to yearly tenancies, and this way leave the way open to increase the rental incomes from their estates. And sometimes the landlords paid the tenants to surrender the leases and agree to yearly tenancies. Now, a few slides here which will figures which will show why landlords might have been keen to have as many as possible of their tenants on yearly tenancies. This slide here shows the rent per acre in Hacketstown Clonmore in 1874. And the yearly tenancies, the rent per acre was 12 shillings and 7 pence. And for lands held under lease, it was roughly half that, 6 shillings and 2 halfpenny. And for those who had got the fee farm grant tenure, the rent was only 2 shillings and 5 pence an acre, about 1/5 of the level for yearly tenancies. So the rewards which landlords could get who persuaded or pressurized or paid their tenants to surrender leases and opt for yearly tenancies were very considerable. But there's no evidence that the Howard owners of the Clonmore estate made any effort to encourage or force the surrender of leases and impose these yearly tenancies. And in this respect, you have to say that it was not typical of what was happening in estates generally. Now, moving on to one of the big things for the estate, the most significant event which changed the character of the estate in the 19th century was its sale in 1874-75 by Henry Tudor Parnell, the younger brother of Charles Stuart Parnell. I mentioned that John Henry Parnell, the father of Charles Stuart, bought the estate in 1858 for his younger son, Henry Tudor. And when Parnell Sr. died unexpectedly a year later, the estate was inherited by the 8-year-old Henry Tudor. And in May 1874, that's 3 years after gaining full control of the estate when he had ceased to be a minor, the son arranged for it to be sold through the Landed Estates Court. And this meant effectively that the estate was mired in debt. And this is a way of dealing with the problem. There's the notice which was published for the sale of the estate in May 1874. There was 13,226 acres in 47 lots. The auction notice highlighted a number of things to encourage investors. It said there were very valuable turf bogs out of which a large income could be realized for many years to come. And going back to what we've just been talking about, it said the those areas held by yearly tenants, and by tenants who have leases which will expire, are capable of very great improvements. So you had possibility of raising your rents and making a good turn on it. We'll have a look at who purchased the land when it was put up for sale. That's a map of Hacketstown, published at the time of the auction, just to show people where it was. You see there the wide main street. Going out of the picture up north, you're the road to Baltinglass in Dublin. Going west here, the road to Carlow. East, the road out to Knockanana and the Wicklow Mountains. And south here, going down towards Tinnahealy. So that's the map at the time. Now, when it was put up for sale, the largest purchaser was a consortium put together by Westby of High Park and Grogan of Baltinglass, along with chemists of Ballinacor. They got 2 English investors with them, and they bought over half the estates, over 7,000 acres, for £39,000. It was an investment for them. And we find that some 16 years later, they had sold 600 acres of this land to James Shepherd of Paulville near Tullow to realise some of their investment. The next biggest purchaser was Thomas Kane McClintock Bunbury. Give me his full title. He became Lord Rathdonnell of Lisnavagh in 1879. He bought over 1,000 acres in Ballyculane, Munstill and Ballasella. And between the two of them, they had bought over 60% of the estate. Then other purchasers, this guy John Vanston, the Dublin solicitor, originally from Hacketstown, so he had strong connections with the area. He bought 1,000 acres in Rothnagrew and Ballyedmond. Michael Fenton of Donard, he bought 373 acres in Pocavada, Kilmacart. Fenton was closely associated with the Howards, the Earls of Wicklow, and Michael Fenton's brother John indeed was the land agent of the Howards. Robert Jones of Woodside, many people will remember the Jones family in Woodside. He was purchased 30 acres there, but he had 1,000 acres or more in County Wicklow. And of course, the Jones family continued to live in Woodside until the 1960s, in fact. Thomas Riley of Hacketstown buying small amount, 50.5 acres, where he was the tenant already in that land. And Edward Keeley bought 10.5 acres. And mainly it included the corn mill, the mill, which is still there, not a mill, outside Hacketstown, which was operated by Thomas Darcy. And that, of course, continued until the early 60s as operating as a mill there. But there were some of the locals. And then the professional classes from Dublin were also in there. Thomas Caldbeck and Bartholomew Rook. Caldbeck was a landowner and a justice of the peace in Dublin, and Rook was a solicitor. And they bought 641 acres. And they borrowed money, £5,900 from the representative church body to fund their part of the cost of borrowing it. Then there was an English army officer called John Geese of Gorey in County Wexford. He retired. He bought 300 acres in Ballyshannon. That land remained there in the family until 1909, when Isabella Geese sold the land under the Land Acts. And the Reverend Henry Stopford, he was from the family of the Earls of Courtown. He was rector of Clonmore for a huge long time, 57 years, from 1824 to 1881. So he bought 600 acres in Davis Hill and Coniscay. And then you have smaller purchasers like Thomas Haskins of Kilkenny. He was part of the Fitzwilliam estate. That's where he lived. John Whelan, no relation, Ratlass and Tullow, gentleman farmer, and Edward Farris near Ballyculduff. Now, overall, you have to say that the sale of the estate by Penal didn't bring about any radical change in the type of landowner. Many of those who bought the land were of the same socio-economic status as the young Penal. The wealthy local landed gentry, aided to a degree by some English investors, but by far the most important players, that would be Westby, Grogan and Rathdonnell. The interest of the professional classes from Dublin, which had been evident in 17 and 1800s, was also evident here. And there was a relatively little interest by landowners, either large or small, who were not from the general area. And generally, the buyers seemed to have had an eye mainly to income or speculation. Then the next phase, I guess, is that the tenants finally become the owners of their land. And from about 1870, the British government passed a number of land acts to improve the position of tenants. And while many of these acts brought about some improvements, it was only with the 1903 Act, known as the Wyndham Act, Wyndham was the Chief Secretary in Ireland at the time, that real success was achieved and most tenants became owners of their lands. Now, the Wyndham Act provided an encouragement to landlords to sell their entire estates. If they sold their entire estate, they could get a bonus of 12% of the price, so a top up of 12%. The tenants got the full cost of buying their holdings, and these loans were repayable to the Land Commission over 68.5 years, and they were always lower than the rent that the tenant had been paying, in some cases a good deal lower. So it was really designed to move the market. And it was very successful. By the early 1920s, in Ireland as a whole, 326,000 tenants had availed of the Wyndham Act, 1903. And in contrast to this, all the legislation before that had only led 74,000 holdings to be purchased. So the Wyndham Act really gave it a kick. The Wyndham Act effectively brought about the end of the landlord system in Ireland. And the purchases in Carlow were similar. Before the 1903 Act, only about 14,000 acres had been bought under the various schemes. And under the Wyndham Act of 1903, 61,000 acres were bought. And so that was a step change there. I'll just put up, for the Hacketstown area really, some of the bigger landlords who sold. Ambrose Moore O'Farrell of Kildare, he was a Catholic landlord who held land around Tinockin-Tinaclash and also down around Michael. And he had almost 4,000 acres, and he sold it in 2010. And Lord O'Donnell of Lisnavagh, he sold 800 acres in Constable Hill and Ballycallane and Ballastalla. And I mentioned this lady Harriet Morton or Gosling, who died in 1916. She sold 644 acres in Drumgwyn. Some more land in Porkavada and in Midvaud, Davis's Hill. Just looking at O'Donnell's for a moment, some of the names will be familiar to people who are from around Hacketstown. Thomas Deering of Constable Hill in Ballycallane, 200 acres. John Lyons of Constable Hill in Ballycallane, 81 acres. And various other people, Nicholas O'Toole of Ballastalla. James Dowling of Constable Hill. I suppose it's John Lyons. Is topical at the moment comes to mind because Jack Lyons, whom we all knew and loved, was a grandson of that John Lyons, and Jack died some time ago, and the farm had recently been sold. But there's the aftermath of the purchasing really was that many of the tenants had the belief or the hope that they wouldn't have to pay their rents to the Land Commission once Ireland achieved political independence from Britain by the Treaty of December 1921, which was approved, of course, by the Dáil in 7th of January 22, and we'll be celebrating all of that later on. But in fact, so about 30% of the people who were paying rent annuities to the Land Commission failed to do so at independence. And I just got a personal note on this, that my uncle, Edward Whelan, who farmed in Ballybrack, just outside Hacketstown, where I grew up, and Jim, who's in the audience tonight, I believe, also grew up. His bank book shows a payment of, it's a bit obscure now, but I just marked it, it's £19, 19 shillings and 10 pence on the 30th of October 1923 for 1 year's arrears of rent due to the Irish Land Commission. And after that date, his payments are faithfully recorded each year in the book. Now, I never knew him personally, so I have no idea what his thinking was when he decided not to make his payments in 1922, but perhaps he misunderstood the meaning of Irish independence and got an awakening. But the Land Acts generally on the Wyndham Act, or in Carlow, not just in Hacketstown, the predominant aspect really is that the major landlords in the county, whom there were three really, one was Rathdonnell, one was Bruin in Oak Park, and one was Kavanagh down in Burris. By and large, they did not sell very much of their Carlow lands. They sold lands outside the county. So Rathdonnell had lands in Ulster, in Monaghan, Tyrone, Fermanagh, and also in County Louth. And he sold all of that land, but he sold very little of his Carlow land. So he still had about 3,500 acres left in Carlow. Kavanagh in Burris sold all his land in Kilkenny and a good deal of his land in Wexford. And he sold about half his land in Carlow. So he still had about 8,000 acres left after that. So he held on to the homeland very much. And Bruin in Oak Park, even more so, he sold a good deal of land in Wexford. He sold very little land, only about 2,000 acres or less in Carlow. So he held on to virtually all these lands. So the result that Carlow, relative to other counties, sold very little land under the Wyndham Act. If you made a ranking of the 32 counties, Carlow would be about fourth from the bottom in terms of the amount of its land which was sold, and it was certainly the lowest in Leinster. So, but mainly due to the fact, I think, that those three major landlords did not sell much of their lands in Carlow. They sold the lands in other counties and maintained the home bias of their lands in Carlow. So that kind of explains the broad picture in the county. Is at the end really. I'll just put up a few more of the. It's just repeating there, or the main landlords who sold the landlord Rathdonnell, again in Ballastalla, and then land Moore of Ireland in Patrician, not Lishan, Moore of Ireland in Tinock, Kilmacart and Drumgwen, and there's Gosling and Drumgwen, and the lady we mentioned before, land in Porkavoda and Brown Bog, Nakava, Eagle Hill, and again Killalongford, down Clonmore, and Ballyshannon. I mentioned there's a Benegee selling our land down there. So that's just some of just for just to give you this idea of some of the areas and some of the names. Some people from around Hacketstown will remember and recognize many of those names. But Pádraig, I'll leave it at that for the moment, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And I think everyone enjoyed that. It was a very comprehensive lecture. Have we any questions? If anyone has, would they just put their, even in the chat, we can pick them up over there to try and keep some form on it. Or if anyone wants to come in with a question, by all means do. Oliver, I think they've covered it so comprehensively. I don't see anyone coming in with questions at the moment.
Yeah. Good.
I'll just wait a second in case anyone wants to come on the microphone and ask a question. Is there anyone who wants to come and unmute themselves and ask a question? No, we've no one. No takers. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, Oliver. Just a small point. Can you hear me?
I can, Monsignor, yes.
Yeah, hello, Oliver.
Yeah.
No, just on the Hardy family you were talking about, Kilmacart, is that the same as the Hardy Eustace?
Are they connected? Yeah, they must be. They must be, because it's such a
name very familiar.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that came in. And the Charles Burton of Ballyman, or the Charles Burton from Ballymanus.
Yeah.
Gareth Burton from Ballyman.
Gareth Burton.
I presume he was something to Billy Byrne, is he?
Oh, I guess so. Yeah, same family. Yeah, yeah.
The same family there, all right.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. There was a story, I think, that at the 1798 rebellion, when the troublesome wife was taking part in the rebellion, that he was sorry that she did so well. That she survived it without coming to any harm. I'm sure that's a malicious story, but there you are.
And the final one,
just been recorded at this stage.
Yeah. Finally, just a quick one on Wentworth. Why was he executed in 1640? The early one, you know.
Sorry,
the Wentworth. Why was
Wentworth,
he executed?
Yeah. He fell foul of the Parliament when he was executed.
Yeah, because he was an important person here, and then he was just
he was,
taken over and executed.
He fell foul. I'm no expert in the area, but he fell foul of the Parliament essentially, and the king reluctantly was forced to sign his death warrant. Of course, he didn't do the king much good at the end, but he bought up all. I mean, the Shillelagh half barony, as they call it, was pretty well all owned by him. You know, yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, man.
Excellent lecture, very interesting.
Thanks, Monsignor. Thank you.
Let's see, is there anything else coming in? I think that's it by way of questions. So we'll move on to Lynn. If you're there, could you come in with a vote of thanks on behalf of the Society?
Thanks, Padraig.
I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Fabulous talk, Oliver. You know, what happened, I suppose, in Hacketstown following 1641 and following Cromwell's victory in 1649 was replicated across the country in Ireland. You know, the social upheaval and the trauma, the human factors of Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, and those changing in landholdings, you know, right through to the detail you've given us there at 1700s and the impacts of penal laws on Catholic landowners before Relief Acts. You know, I was looking at listening to you there on the 18th and 19th century. You were talking about, you know, using land as security for borrowing, and that sort of boom that happened there as well, which we're familiar with as our Irish boom. But we could have told poor John Henry Leonard what was going to happen there. But very, very interesting. And right through to that 19th and 20th century, which enabled those tenants to acquire and, you know, full ownerships of their lands and what happened. But I think most importantly, what you've captured there is such detail, Oliver, you know, of reflection and research of a piece of Irish history that is now captured and it's shared, and that's for future generations. And I think that's the very essence of what the Society is about as well. And so for that, we're extremely grateful. We're extremely grateful for your time in sharing that with us tonight and for all the research and work that you've done. And so on behalf of the Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks to Oliver Whelan for your wonderful talk this evening, Oliver. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, for that. Just to remind everyone on just a few other matters, housekeeping and whatever, it's been a strange year for us. We haven't had meetings, we haven't had lectures since March. And therefore, there's a number of people whose subs will be outstanding at this stage. And just to remind people, they can be paid by PayPal, by standing order. They can be posted directly to Chaz at PO Box 162 Carlow. And if you go on to our website at www.carlowhistorical.com, you'll find the membership page there where it can be paid online there. Just to say, in the times we're in, and everyone knows that each year we produce Carlow Vienna, and there's a large number of sponsors who help us to get that across the line every year, and this year it'll be exactly the same. Please, in the current circumstances, support our local sponsors on this, because they've been good to us, and I think most retail shops are now crying out for it to be sponsored back and to be held back. So I think that's a thing like that. While we're on Carlow Vienna, the launch of the Carlow Vienna will be on Thursday night, the 2nd of December. Highly likely to be an online event like this one. And our guest who will launch the Carlow Vienna 2021 will be Minister Malcolm Noonan. And I'd say it'll be most likely an online event. Again, just I'm putting up again, this is Oliver's book. If you want to read more about what he spoke about tonight, the book is well worthwhile, good read. And again, as I say, if you want to buy Carlow Vienna's, say the 2020 issue or back issues, again, you can do it on our website. Finally, again, Oliver, thanks on my behalf. It was a great night. Kind of a bit of an experiment for us, the first time we've tried this, and I think it's been hugely successful for us. And our next lecture, as we know, they're normally the third Wednesday of a month, so it's the third Wednesday of January, Wolves in Ireland by Dr. Kieran Hickey. And I think that's it for me. I don't think there's anything else. Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for staying with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.